The Hand of the Necromancer by Brad Strickland, Chapter 10. The big showdown came 2 days later when Sarah finally persuaded Johnny to confide his worries to her. Johnny had received his last pay envelope in the mail. It wasn't very much money, but it reminded him of the job he had lost, and thinking about Miss Farrington's accusations depressed him. When Sarah telephoned to chat, Johnny admitted he was unhappy. Sarah listened with sympathy and then suggested that he teach her how to play chess, something they had talked about before. Maybe it would take Johnny's mind off his troubles for a little while. He didn't really think it would, but then it might be sort of cheerful to play again. He and Fergie always played hard-fought, interesting games of chess, and the professor was usually a good opponent. But with Fergie away and the professor preoccupied, Johnny hadn't touched his chessboard in weeks. He met Sarah at the public library, and they set up Johnny's chessboard in the conversation room on the first floor. Quiet talking was allowed there, and lots of people met there to play chess or checkers. Sometimes spectators even collected in small audiences to watch games and debate each move in whispers. Johnny was glad to see no one was there because he felt self-conscious about playing chess in front of people. He arranged the pieces on the board. Sarah watched as Johnny explained how each chess piece could move, and then she moved them herself, making sure she understood. Next, Johnny explained what a gambit was, a series of beginning chess moves that could be developed into an attack or a defense. There were a lot of standard openings, but they would begin with very simple ones. Then he hit a couple of pawns in his hands, and she chose the hand with the white one. Okay, he said, white always moves first. Now the first time you move a pawn, it can go either 1 or 2 squares. I'd start with the one in front, and the queen in front of the king or the queen. And then, as they moved the chessmen, Sarah started in again about Matthias Mergel and what he had to do with the storm in the park. I didn't see him, but he really gave you the creeps, didn't he? She asked. Trying not to show either annoyance or anxiety, Johnny kept his gaze on the board. Yeah, I guess he did. He's a peculiar guy. Sarah stared over the chess pieces, frowning at him. Weird, huh? Does he run through the streets in his underwear playing a banjo and singing Hail Columbia? Does he turn into a werewolf when the wolfsbane blooms and the moon is shining bright? Let's just play chess, okay? Johnny did not feel like talking about Matthias Mergel. For one thing, he was a mystery, and Johnny did not know all that much. Then, two, Johnny had a bad feeling that no matter what he said, Sarah would misunderstand. But Sarah would not let the matter drop. As they moved their chess pieces, she kept asking questions, and she refused to let Johnny get away with shrugging them off. Little by little, she wore down Johnny's reluctance. Finally, Johnny sighed and dropped his voice to a whisper. Okay, but you'll never believe me. He took a deep breath. It all goes back to the witch things, he told her about Estrius Blackleech. Then he said, I think Mr. Mergel wants to get all of Blackleech's magical stuff so he can cast spells too. He must have been the one who broke into the professor's house and later stole all the Blackleech pieces from the museum. He got me fired, and I think he tried to kill the professor with that magic lightning in the park. Sarah frowned at him for a few moments. Then she grinned, her eyes crinkling. She chuckled in a way that people do when they think something funny is about to happen. What's the joke, Dixon? She asked. Johnny scowled at her. I knew you wouldn't believe me, he muttered. Well, who in the world would? Demanded Sarah, irritation flashing in her eyes. You are kidding, aren't you? I mean, about magic? How could he tell her about the things he had seen, about zombies and ghosts and trolleys that could go back in time? Sarah had never encountered the sort of bizarre people who seemed to be attracted to Dustin Heights, like iron to a magnet. Just forget it, said Johnny wearily. Sarah moved her knight. It was a bad move, opening up her queen to a bishop attack. She glanced back at him and seemed surprised at his bitter expression. Oh, come on, Dixon. Nobody believes in wizards and witches, that kind of stuff. She sounded like a big sister talking to a 6-year-old brat of a little brother. Is this Mergel guy just plain nuts? Johnny ignored the chance to take Sarah's queen. I guess he is. He thinks Blackleech was a real magician, and he wants to be a magician too. We know there's no such thing as magic, so let's just forget about him, okay? Sarah gave him a quizzical glance. This really bothers you. Okay, Dixon, convince me. Why do you think Blackleech's snow globe and the other little toys have spooky power? What makes you think Mergel has malicious magic on his mind? I told you I saw him at the park, insisted Johnny. His voice had risen and it almost squeaked. He made an effort to speak more softly. He was holding some kind of long staff, and he raised it up to point at the sky, and then he struck the ground with it, and after that, those weird clouds came boiling up out of nowhere, and the lightning began. But thunderstorms happen in the summer, Sarah objected. That one could have just been a coincidence. Witches are supposed to be able to raise storms, insisted Johnny. Oh, Dixon, I don't believe in witches. And I didn't see Murgle do any funny business with a staff. Maybe you just imagined you saw him. Johnny glared at her. I'm sorry I told you anything. Just forget it. But with a quick, spiteful movement, Johnny swept his bishop diagonally across the board and took Sarah's queen. There. You didn't watch what you were doing, and I captured your most important piece. Are you going to concentrate now? That was mean. Johnny gave her a crabby look. I think you're pretty mean to say I'm crazy, because I think Murgle is trying to do witchcraft. Maybe it doesn't really work. Maybe he's off his rocker, but that doesn't mean I am. Sarah looked angry. If you're going to be that way, Johnny Dixon, I don't want to play this stupid game anymore. Johnny felt like yelling, but he kept his voice quiet. It's not a stupid game just because you're too dumb to learn how to play it. Sarah glowered at him. She got up and stalked out of the conversation room. Angry at himself, Johnny folded the board and packed it and the chess pieces back in the box. He trudged back to Fillmore Street with a dejected sense that he had just lost a friend. He spent the rest of the day in his room trying to read and listening to his old Motorola radio. That night, he thought long and hard about everything that had happened. If only there was some way of catching Mr. Myrtle in the act, or finding some of the loot from the museum in his possession. But he had no idea of how to do that. If Fergie were here, he thought, he'd know what to do. Even if he didn't believe Myrtle was an evil magician, Fergie would come up with some plan to discover exactly what mischief he was trying to pull. Unfortunately, Fergie was still hundreds of miles away, and Johnny didn't have his friend's willingness to take chances. He wished he were braver and older. He wished he could live up to Professor Childermass's idea of him. The professor always treated Johnny like a sensible adult, not a child. But, surrounded by a troublesome cloud of doubts and regrets, Johnny felt very childlike indeed. Professor Childermass sympathized with Johnny, but he couldn't offer much help. After all, he said, you wouldn't want to involve Sarah in anything dangerous, would you? And if jolly old Mr. Murgle really is trying to gain control of evil magical powers, he could be pretty dangerous. The two of them sat in the professor's kitchen, waiting for a pan of dark chocolate walnut fudge to harden. It was the day after Sarah and Johnny had quarreled in the public library. Although he hadn't said a word about the fight to Grandma or Grandpa, Johnny had told the professor everything. The old man was his good friend, and sometimes it's easier to talk about certain things to friends. Johnny was sipping a tall, cool glass of milk, and the professor was drinking a steaming cup of coffee. His eyes glittered shrewdly behind his gold-rimmed glasses as he said, You know, John, maybe it's better that you and Sarah stay away from each other for a few days. I expect that if you give it time, she'll decide that you were both a little too hasty. I didn't want to hurt her feelings, admitted Johnny. But I don't think she'll be my friend again. She thinks I'm cranky and maybe crazy, too. She does she? Asked Professor Childermass, looking concerned. You might have a problem there. Of course, I don't mind the good citizens of Dustin Heights thinking I'm cranky. In fact, I rather enjoy it, because it keeps a lot of irritating, obnoxious people away. But at your age, you shouldn't have that kind of reputation, John. I'll tell you what, when this is over, I'll invite Sarah and you to another picnic and we'll smooth things over. After all, they say time heals all wounds. I hope it does, replied Johnny. Sarah was kind of a special friend. Your first girlfriend? Asked the professor. No, Johnny frowned. I mean, she's a girl and she's my friend, but that's all. I hope all this will be over in a week or two, said the professor. He got up and took the fudge from the pan. Here, sample this. The candy was creamy and delicious, and Johnny nodded to show that it was a success. He swallowed and said, What do you mean you hope it's going to be over in a week or two? What are you planning, Professor? But Professor Childermass just winked. Don't fret about it. There are wheels within wheels, as the saying goes. And if all the wheels roll along as they should, I'll prove to the authorities that Mr. Matthias Myrtle of Boston, Massachusetts, is a villain who's committed 2 burglaries, and if that doesn't settle the fellow's hash, I don't know what will. Johnny was still far from satisfied, but he made up his mind to wait and see. He simply didn't know what other choice he had. And that is the end of Chapter 10.